The static crackled first. Then came the voice, cold, bored, dismissive, recorded in a language no human had ever heard before, but the words didn't matter. What mattered was the tone. The tone of a being who had already stopped caring about the outcome of a war before it even ended. Mark the system as cleared. The species is not worth the fuel cost of a second engagement. Leave the wreck in orbit. Let the savages have their scrap. That was it. That was the verdict. After 3 weeks of fighting, after thousands of lives lost on both sides, after humanity's first contact with an alien civilization ended not with a bang, not with a surrender, not even with a proper goodbye, but with an alien commander ordering his fleet to retreat and leaving behind a broken warship the size of a small city, because towing it home wasn't worth the effort. Humanity didn't know it yet, but that single act of contempt, that lazy, dismissive decision to dump a piece of useless scrap into Earth's orbit, was about to become the most expensive mistake the Vothar Hegemony would ever make. If you're new here, welcome to HFY Universe, where we tell stories about humanity rising when no one expected us to. Hit that subscribe button now, because trust me, you do not want to miss where this story goes. Now, let's go back to the beginning. 3 weeks earlier, nobody on Earth knew aliens existed. There were theories, of course. There always are. Late-night radio shows, grainy footage, government denials. But nothing prepared the world for the morning when 17 ships, sleek, dark, and utterly silent, appeared in low orbit without warning. No transmissions, no demands, just ships hanging in the sky like a held breath. For 6 hours, humanity did what humanity does best: argued. Military leaders debated whether to fire first. Diplomats scrambled for any kind of communication. Scientists tried to understand the technology hovering above them, technology that defied everything they thought they knew about physics. Then, without warning, the first ship descended over a remote testing facility and fired. It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't even a warning shot. To the Vothar, it was closer to a formality, a routine first contact protocol that involved testing a new species' military response before deciding whether they were worth negotiating with or simply worth ignoring. The facility was destroyed in seconds, and for the first time, humanity understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an evaluation, and they were failing it. What happened next surprised everyone, including, as it would turn out, the Vothar themselves. Within an hour, fighter jets were in the air, not because anyone believed they could win, not because anyone had a plan, but because doing nothing was somehow worse than doing something, even if that something was almost certainly suicide. The first wave of jets didn't even get close. Whatever shields protected the alien ships shrugged off conventional weapons like they were rain. Pilots reported their missiles simply, stopping midair as if hitting an invisible wall. But here's the thing about humans: we don't stop just because something doesn't work. We get creative. By the second day, military strategists from a dozen countries were sharing information in real time, something that frankly had never happened before in human history, not like this. Old rivalries didn't disappear, but for the first time there was a shared understanding. This fight wasn't about borders anymore. It was about survival for everyone. Reverse engineering began almost immediately. Wreckage from destroyed human aircraft was analyzed. Debris from alien weapons fire was studied. Within 72 hours, engineers had identified a frequency pattern in the alien shields, a kind of resonance they could exploit, not to break through, but to disrupt. It wasn't a weapon, it was an idea. A wild, half-formed, probably won't work idea. But humanity tried it anyway. On day 5, a coordinated strike using modified electromagnetic pulse devices, built in under 72 hours using equipment never designed for this purpose, managed to disable the shields on one of the smaller alien scout ships for just under 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. A barrage of conventional missiles fired the moment the shields flickered, tore into the scout ship's hull. It didn't destroy the ship, but it damaged it, badly. For the first time since their arrival, the Vothar fleet did something humanity hadn't seen them do yet. They retreated just slightly, just enough to reassess. What humanity didn't know, what they wouldn't learn until much, much later, was that the Vothar hegemony wasn't some grand galactic empire on a mission of conquest. They were in their own way tired. The hegemony had been expanding for centuries, stretching their resources across hundreds of systems, fighting wars on a dozen fronts against species far more advanced and far more dangerous than a backwater planet of carbon-based primates who'd only just discovered space travel. To the Vothar command structure, Earth wasn't a prize. It wasn't even a threat. It was a footnote, a system flagged for standard evaluation and asset acquisition, meaning, check if there's anything valuable, take it if it's easy, and if it's not easy, mark it as low priority and move on. The unexpected resistance, humanity's stubborn, chaotic, wildly improvised fight, wasn't enough to make Earth a priority. but it was enough to make it not worth the cost of finishing the job properly. And so, after 18 days of fighting that cost the Vothar one scout ship, minor damage to two others, and more importantly, time and resources they couldn't easily justify spending on a planet with no immediate strategic value, the order came down. Withdraw, mark the system as cleared, leave the wreck behind. That wreck was the damaged scout ship, though scout ship doesn't really do it justice. By human standards, it was enormous. Nearly 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapon emplacements, most of them now stripped for parts before the Vothar left, its hull scorched and broken in places, drifting in a slow, dead orbit above the planet that had, against all odds, managed to hurt it. To the Vothar, it was scrap, not worth the fuel to tow home, not worth the risk of leaving it intact and armed. So they stripped what they could, weapons systems, navigation cores, anything with obvious military value, and left the rest. A 2-kilometer-long, gutted, drifting hulk. A monument to humanity's first war, and a message, intended or not, this is what you're worth to us. Scrap. For the first few weeks after the Vothar fleet vanished from human sensors entirely, the world existed in a strange, suspended state. Was it really over? Were they coming back? Every government on Earth braced for round 2. It didn't come. Instead, what stayed was that massive, silent, broken ship in orbit, visible on clear nights as a faint moving star, slowly tumbling against the backdrop of real stars. For a long time, nobody knew what to do about it. Some argued it should be destroyed, a precaution in case it was some kind of trap, a Trojan horse left behind to spy on humanity or worse. Others argued it should be left alone entirely, untouched in case any attempt to interact with it triggered some kind of automated defense system. Or worse, signaled to the Vothar that humanity was tampering with their property, an excuse to come back and finish what they'd started. But there was a third group, smaller, quieter, but increasingly persistent. Engineers, scientists, people who looked at that drifting wreck and saw something other than a threat or a curiosity. They saw 2 kilometers of alien technology just sitting there, unguarded, unclaimed. It took 8 months of debate, committees, international agreements, and let's be honest, a fair amount of let's just see what happens recklessness before the first human mission launched toward the wreck. They called the ship, informally at first, Old Iron. Nobody quite remembers who came up with the name. Some say it was a joke, a reference to how massive and ancient-looking the hull was, even though by alien standards the ship probably wasn't that old at all. Others say it was meant as a kind of defiance, Old Iron useless to them, but not to us. Whatever the origin, the name stuck, and it would go on to mean a lot more than anyone expected. The first boarding team consisted of 12 people, engineers, a handful of military personnel for security, and 2 scientists whose job was simply to document everything they found, in case it turned out to be the last thing they ever did. What they found when they finally cut through the outer hull and stepped inside Old Iron for the first time changed everything. The inside of Old Iron was nothing like what anyone expected. There was no glowing alien tech humming with mysterious energy, no dramatic control rooms lighting up at their approach. Most of the ship was dark, cold, and silent, power systems shut down or destroyed, corridors twisted from impact damage, sections completely open to vacuum where the hull had been breached. But it was big, bigger than anyone had grasped from the outside, entire decks the size of stadiums, cargo bays that could fit dozens of buildings, corridors wide enough to drive trucks through if there'd been any roads to drive on. And everywhere was alien engineering, materials nobody on Earth had names for yet, systems that didn't operate on principles human science fully understood, wiring, if you could call it that, made from something that looked like woven crystal, doors that, even with no power, were nearly impossible to force open with anything humanity had. It would have been easy to be discouraged, to look at all of this and think, this is too advanced, too alien, too far beyond us, we'll never understand any of it. But humanity has a long, long history of taking things it doesn't fully understand and figuring out how to use them anyway. Ancient sailors didn't understand magnetism, but they used compasses. Early pilots didn't fully understand aerodynamics, but they flew anyway and learned as they went. So the engineers did what engineers do. They started small. The first real breakthrough came almost by accident 6 weeks into the salvage operation. A junior engineer, barely out of university, there mostly to assist with cataloging, noticed that one of the ship's internal power conduits, though completely dead, still had a faint residual charge, not enough to power anything, but enough to register on a meter. That residual charge told them something important. The system wasn't destroyed. It was just off, dormant, like a phone with a dead battery, not a phone with a broken screen. If it was just off, then maybe it could be turned back on. It took another 4 months of careful, painstaking work. Every attempt to interface human technology with alien systems had to be done with extreme caution. Nobody wanted to accidentally trigger something dangerous, or worse, send some kind of automated distress signal that might bring the Vothar back. But slowly, section by section, parts of old iron began to wake up. Emergency lighting, dim, amber, alien in color and tone, flickered on in sections that had been dark for nearly a year. Life support systems, miraculously still partially functional, began cycling air through corridors that hadn't held breathable atmosphere since the ship had been abandoned. And then, in one of the ship's secondary engineering bays, a section the Vothar clearly hadn't bothered to fully strip, probably because it looked, to them, like nothing important, the team found something that would change the entire trajectory of the project. A reactor core, not the ship's main reactor, that had been removed entirely before the Vothar left, a gaping hole in the ship's lower decks where it used to sit. This was smaller. Auxiliary. The kind of system that, on a ship this size, probably wasn't even considered worth listing on an inventory before they left. To the Vothar it was nothing, a backup, a spare part. To humanity, it was the single most advanced piece of functional power generation technology anyone on Earth had ever seen. The engineer who found it, a woman who'd spent most of her career working on conventional nuclear reactors before joining the salvage program, later described the moment in an interview that, for a while, became one of the most watched clips on the planet. She said she'd been documenting the bay for nearly an hour, cataloging components she didn't recognize when she noticed something strange. A faint hum, not from any equipment her team had brought aboard, from the wall itself. She placed a hand against the bulkhead and felt it, a vibration, subtle, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Something somewhere behind that wall was still running. It took the team 3 more days to trace the source, carefully mapping power conduits that, as far as anyone could tell, led nowhere, until they found a sealed compartment, hidden behind what looked like a maintenance panel containing the auxiliary reactor. Dormant, but not dead, idling almost, as if it had simply been waiting for someone to notice it. Word of the discovery spread through the project instantly. For the first time, there was a tangible sense that this wasn't just a salvage operation anymore. This was something else. An opportunity nobody had quite dared to hope for. Here's where the story could have gone differently. Here's where, in 100 other timelines, humanity might have made a critical mistake. They could have rushed it, tried to immediately rip that reactor out, study it in a lab somewhere, reverse engineer it as fast as possible, maybe even try to weaponize the knowledge before they fully understood it. Plenty of people argued for exactly that. But the people actually working inside old iron, the engineers who had spent months crawling through its corridors, who had come to know this ship better than anyone alive, argued for something different. Don't take it out, learn how it works in place, learn the ship. It was slower, much slower. It meant years, not months. It meant treating old iron not as a treasure chest to be looted, but as something closer to a teacher. A massive, silent, alien teacher that piece by piece was showing humanity things it had no right to learn this quickly. And so began what would later be called, somewhat informally, the long build, the multi-year project to restore old iron, not to its original Vothar configuration, but into something new, something human. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know where you think this is going. I read every single one, and some of you have predicted some wild twists in past videos that genuinely surprised me. Alright, back to it. The long build took nearly 6 years. 6 years of engineers from countries that less than a decade earlier had been geopolitical rivals, working side by side in shifts that ran around the clock. 6 years of trial and error, of systems that worked perfectly one day and inexplicably failed the next, of breakthroughs that solved one problem and immediately revealed 3 more. It wasn't glamorous work most of the time. For every breakthrough that made headlines, there were months of failures that didn't. Systems that powered on for a few seconds and then shut down again with no clear explanation. Materials that behaved predictably in tests, then cracked under conditions nobody had anticipated. More than once, the entire project nearly lost funding, as governments grew impatient with the slow pace and the lack of dramatic results. What kept it going more than anything was the crew itself. Engineers who had started the project in their 20s were, by year 6, in their 30s. Some had got married during the project. A few had started families. One team even held a wedding inside one of old iron's restored cargo bays because, as the bride reportedly put it, "We spent more time here than anywhere else. It felt right." The ship stopped being just a project. It became, in a strange way, a home. A shared achievement that belonged not to any single country but to everyone who'd put years of their lives into it. The reactor, the spare part the Vothar had left behind, was eventually understood well enough to be safely restarted. Not at full power, not even close, but enough to bring entire sections of the ship back to life, enough to begin testing systems that had been dormant for years. The hull, despite the damage, turned out to be remarkably resilient. Whatever alloy the Vothar used, it was tougher than anything humanity had ever produced, and importantly, it could be repaired. Slowly, using techniques that combined human welding methods with newly understood alien material science. Patch by patch, section by section, the breaches in Old Iron's hull were sealed. Weapons were the hardest part. The Vothar had stripped everything obviously offensive before leaving. Every weapon emplacement was either removed entirely or left as an empty, useless housing. But here's something the Vothar didn't account for. Humanity didn't need their weapons. Humanity had its own. The empty weapon mounts, designed for systems far more powerful than anything Earth had ever built, were eventually retrofitted with human-designed weapons. Not as powerful as what the Vothar had used, not even close, but functional, and mounted on a hull and powered by systems that were leagues beyond anything humanity could have built from scratch. It was, in a strange way, the perfect combination. Vothar engineering providing the framework, the bones, the power, the scale, and human ingenuity, filling in the gaps with whatever worked, whatever was available, whatever humanity could build with the resources they actually had. By the end of Year 6, Old Iron wasn't a Vothar warship anymore. It wasn't really anything that had ever existed before. It was something new, something built from the wreckage of someone else's mistake. And on a quiet morning with no fanfare, no global broadcast, no grand ceremony, just a small crew, mostly the same engineers who'd spent years getting to know every inch of this ship, Old Iron's engines came online for the first time since the day it was abandoned. And it moved. It wasn't much, that first movement. A slow drift, a gentle correction of orbit, nothing that would look impressive on camera. But for the people who'd spent 6 years of their lives on this project, it might as well have been the moon landing all over again. Old Iron was alive, and it was theirs. News of the ship's activation didn't stay quiet for long. Within days, satellite images were circulating, grainy but unmistakable. The massive derelict that had hung in Earth's sky for years, the silent reminder of humanity's first, humiliating contact with an alien civilization, was moving under its own power. The world reacted in a way that, looking back, probably surprised even the people who'd built it. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even really pride, not at first. It was something closer to relief. For years, Old Iron had been a constant, visible reminder of how small humanity was in the grand scheme of things, a piece of someone else's trash, left behind because it wasn't worth taking home.